Thank you, Sue, and good evening to everyone. And I want to just thank Sue herself for not only putting together this evening, but for her visionary work in forming community calls, which was already well established before October 7th, and which we need so desperately in the wake of that. Thank you so much, Sue, and thank you to our partners also at the JCC and Russell Berry Foundation. We're so grateful. Thank you to our panelists for taking the time to travel here to be with us tonight, and thank you to all of you for coming. Before we begin, I want to frame the evening in a couple of ways. After October 7th, when we were all kind of shattered by what happened, I picked up Rabbi Jonathan Sachs's book, The Dignity of Difference. And in the book, he says, which was actually written after 9/11, he says that if religion is going to be a force for brutal violence in the world, then it has to be a force for the opposite as well. And so it's not only should, but it must provide a sense of morality and ethics in the world. And so we are here as Americans, where we often talk about our rights, the freedoms that we have, the rights that we deserve, and we should advocate and want those rights equally for everyone. But we don't often talk about our responsibilities to each other. And Rabbi Sachs says that that's something that we really need to do. What are we ethically and morally obligated to do for each other in a shared society? And that's one of the reasons that our panelists are here, to begin and to have that conversation. How can we come together, not because we want something from each other, but because we want to build a shared community? The other thing that Rabbi Sachs talks about in the book is that in interfaith and cross-cultural work, a lot of times the focus is on what we have in common, and that makes sense, it's natural, right? We want to know, I was just talking actually to the mayor of Tenafly, right? We want to know, oh, I share this ritual with you, we have shared values, we have shared beliefs. But what the elephant in the room becomes too large to ignore when we never talk about our differences. And so another aim of this night is to be able to come together and not be afraid to talk about what we don't have in common and about the opinions that we don't share. And we see that fragmentation of society. We saw it way before October 7th, and October 7th has just exploded it all the more. So that's like a second framing that I want to bring to this evening. And the final point is that this evening is a start. It's called Dialogue in Good Faith because we're here with openness, with curiosity, to hear what the other has to say. But it's hopefully not an ending, it's just a beginning. And with that, I want to turn it over to our wonderful panelists and to start our dialogue in good faith tonight. So can you give us an overview of your interfaith and cross-cultural work, and what led you to do it? What in your learning or in your faith has led you to particularly, invest in this work?
Okay, great. First, I just want to thank the organizers, Tikva and Sue, for the invitation. Just really excited to have the conversation. Honored to meet these incredible panelists as well. And also, look, I'm a reluctant sort of conversation partner. Unfortunately, I bought into the hype of the academic world in which they basically told us interfaith work was really for the chaplains and for people who want to be public. But if you want to get tenure, you actually can write, sit in the library, and don't talk to these people on the ground because they don't matter. And so, in some ways, that's how I pursued all my work. But when I was at Haverford College back in 2008. Two students, one happened to be a white Jewish kid and one was of Palestinian descent, said, look, Professor Johnson, we can't find anyone to lead a seminar on how to talk about Israel-Palestine. Would you be willing to facilitate the conversation? I'm like, okay, I'm not tenured. There are all other senior colleagues that said, we don't want to do this. I was like, you know what? I'm sure I'll try it. And it was actually a really remarkable group because they were all invested in acknowledging sort of competing traumas and overlapping traumas, and for the first time, sort of like introduced into a world that I kind of knew about from reading the newspaper, but not really know anything firsthand. And so I'll say from there, I was still kind of like skittish about really diving into the material. And then when I went to Georgetown and collaborated with my colleague, Jean Lennerblatt, on this book, I was sort of, I saw again as, oh, this is an academic book, try to engage the public, but I'm really more interested in all the theory. And slowly over time, the Shalom Hartman Institute being a central sort of character here, sort of pulled me into the conversation. And clearly, now I'm invested in a very different way now that I'm at the divinity school, in part because I see the real trauma, and I can hear the trauma in people's voices, and I feel as if I've been reluctant, in part because now I have to really invest myself into the conversation. And I think that's the hardest part, is to really dive into it as an embodied person, not simply with your head.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you all. I also would like to echo the sense of gratitude. At Duke University, we have a very popular class. The title of the class is Radical Conversations. The class is by design to talk about unspeakable, very difficult topics: abortion, same-sex marriage, trans rights, separation of church and state. After October 7, a class that is designed to speak difficult topics, engage with difficult issues, unanimously that class decided not to talk about what's going on October 7 and post-October 7. So I'm really grateful that at a time, even the courses that's designed to facilitate these kind of difficult conversations are intentionally shying away from having these difficult conversations, or even bringing people together to discuss what happened on October 7 or since then. Kudos to the organizers, my friend Tikva and Sue and everyone. That's why I said immediately yes, because it's not happening enough. My journey into this interfaith conversation was slightly different than academia. And I'm so glad the event is titled as Dialogue in Good Faith, because it acknowledges that there is bad faith, but also it acknowledges that faith is good. It is quite remarkably disturbing for me to categorically recognize religion when it's part of the problem, when it's countercultural, when it is source of violence, bigotry, and hate, but struggle to recognize the faith when it's part of the solution, when it's part of the reconciliation and healing. When people see me, my passionate work in interfaith dialogue, often quite troubling, honestly, they assume that somehow I must be somewhat diluted version of my faith. I had to compromise who I am as a Muslim. I shouldn't be like really practicing some sort of a modernized or westernized version of Islam that allows me, enables me to venture into understanding other faith tradition and draw wisdom, inspiration from them. Quite the opposite, actually. My deep commitment to Islam, my commitment, my sincere and serious commitment to Islam, that's at the heart of my engagement with our Jewish, Christian, and other faith siblings from the other faith traditions. Because initially, I grew up in an incredibly despicably hateful, anti-Semitic, racist, homophobic environment. My secular upbringing in Turkey, when I was growing up, it wasn't religious, again, secular, nationalist, almost to a point of chauvinistic education, filled me and pumped me so much hate into my heart about other, including members of the LGBTQ, but especially against Jews and Judaism and Zionism and Israel. It was me becoming religious. It was me fascinated with Islam and becoming a very serious Muslim that saved me, that God of love allowed me to take that poison out of my system and take the nearest exit and drive in the opposite direction. Now I'm a fellow at a Jewish American organization working in Jewish-Muslim relations. But again, what drove me, or what has been driving me, is my sincere and serious commitment to my religion. If religion is taught well, if you don't take religion seriously, or however you experience religion is your issue, but people who are religious and take their religion seriously, when the engagement and dialogue happens between them, there's a whole different level of richness. There's an incredible level of depth and spiritual energy and moral spark comes out of this that excites me. Because if cross-faith, cross-cultural engagement is done, again, successfully, not only you develop appreciation, understanding, knowledge about other faith tradition, but at some point that cross-faith engagement becomes a mirror to you. You see yourself, your faith tradition in it. As you develop appreciation and respect for one another, you become even more deeply rooted in your own faith tradition. You grow in your own faith tradition. That's the kind of religious engagement that I can never have enough of. I have this unending appetite for. It only makes me a better Muslim, and that's why I'm in it.
I also just want to say thank you to Tikva and to Sue for hosting tonight, and also just it's an honor to be in conversation with both of you. My work at Central primarily focuses on our justice initiatives, and so at a very practical level, we rely on interfaith partnerships to get things done, criminal justice reform, to show up in conversation as a united moral voice on issues of reentry, people coming home from prison, and to be able to speak out against what's happening at Rikers requires a unified faith voice to kind of have that kind of power. But also, I just feel also Jewishly very called to that. I think in Genesis we read the blueprint for our world and the blueprint of creation, and we learn right away that it's not good for people to be alone, that we are made to live in community. And to think as that definition of community unfolds throughout our text, what that means, and it means that we are responsible not just for the people in our community, but to the people outside of it who come into our community. We're accountable to one another. We owe each other something. And I think that that definition of community is the basis for creating a society in which every person has what they need to thrive and flourish. And I think that's the goal of our justice work. And so, just both on a theological and practical way, I rely on our partnerships to kind of imagine a shared future in which everyone has what they need to flourish.
Thank you. How have the past few months affected your work, and has it changed any of your work or shifted your thinking in any way? Rebecca, you want to start?
Yeah. The past, it's really kind of felt like just such a heaviness, just walking around, and I, especially immediately after October 7th and through the following months, I personally felt just so, just kind of like a dark cloud, and really, questioning some of the interfaith coalitions and justice work is not always the easiest space to be in, but I have found that if we can engage through kind of shared mourning and shared pain, there's a power in maybe not agreeing with one another, but coming together through pain. And so we've been trying to do that at Central. We've been hosting conversations with activists from Israel, Palestinian and Jewish activists who are focused on shared society, and really trying to ask the hard questions of, what is this moment like for you? What has this been like for you and your community? Where are the pain points, and how can we sit together, maybe not mourning the exact same things, but sit together in shared pain?
It is impossible not to be affected by what happened in October 7 and since then. You don't have to be Jewish or Muslim, or as long as you have minimally functional heart. The barbarism, the savagery, the kind of violence that evil terrorist organization has committed to civilians in Israel. If anybody doesn't have any kind of moral reaction to this despicable, reprehensible, disgusting acts of Hamas terrorist organization, I don't know, that means one has to question whether or not you have a minimally functional heart or not. And also, the civilian toll that the Gazan Palestinians are facing. As we all know, not all members of the Palestinians who live in Gaza are part of the Hamas. Hamas doesn't represent. This is an evil, criminal organization. If anything, Palestinians suffer more in the hands of this terrorist organization. Despite where you stand on it, not seeing the human tragedy, sheer human tragedy on that side of the aisle, this is not about comparison or either or but. One has to just, on the basic human level, should be able to empathize the sheer human suffering on that side as well. What's going on there is complicated enough. What really struggles or disturbs me is the way in which this conflict spills over to the United States, and the effects and impacts our life. Of all the conflicts around the world, no other conflict spills over to the United States and makes university presidents resign, or the kind of impact that creates. To me, the biggest shock is people's shock against this. If anything, it feels like rising anti-Semitism in despicable and reprehensible level, rising Islamophobia. People's shock is a source of shock to those of us who were paying attention to this and working to prevent something like this for decades. Because it feels like society is eating fast food 9 times a day, drinking gallons of soda, and people are surprised that she's or he's not healthy, or has a long list of health. It feels that way. I think somehow, what were we expecting when we didn't invest into those relationships, when we didn't address those bridge building efforts, community building efforts, intergroup efforts in better times, when so many evil forces that are trying to divide us, put enmity and hostility between us, were working day and night. So if anything, October 7th didn't create anything new. It brought to surface to all the neglected areas of our moral fabric that we are now paying a huge price. I really hope in the shock and the panic of October 7th, not only we will not be morally numb towards people who are not of our faith, towards people who are not part of our tribe, but also we will pay attention to what exits we have missed. How did we end up here? Because no one becomes 700 pounds obese with so many health overnight. And we are not going to bounce back, as that person will not gain their health immediately. We have to do the reverse engineering of hate. Because two things about hate. A, as despicable, as reprehensible, as disgusting as hate, racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, Islamophobia, it has a very long incubation period. It takes time for communities to absorb, digest hate. It takes time. The innate goodness each and every one of us, individual and collectively, resist towards hate. If hate has risen the way it is rising now, that means it came a long time that we didn't pay attention to. And the second thing about hate is, it's very honest. When it poisons hearts and minds, it doesn't do it quietly. It was announcing in so many ways. In my community, I have been, like many others, warning some of the ways in which my community's hearts and minds have been vulnerable and corrupted by anti-Semitism. My community was having a hard time recognizing it because it's thinly veiled under pro-Palestinian activism. It's thinly veiled through human rights activism, social justice causes. But we could have been more diligent, more vigilant, more careful. And similarly, the Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hatred in various Jewish communities was again coming from different grounds. I would say, that's the last thing I would say for now. I think it's a wake-up call for Jews and Muslims. We were able to recognize anti-Semitism and Islamophobia of the right, far right, very successfully. We were able to recognize it, condemn it, because it's coming from the Christian nationalists, white supremacists. But we neglected, A, the anti-Semitism coming from the Muslim communities, and the anti-Muslim hatred coming from the Jewish communities, and the anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that is brewing from the left, political and ideological left. If anything, October 7th is a wake-up call for us to pay attention and not be partisan, not be ideological, tribal, recognize the hate when it comes from the other side, but fail to recognize it and address it when the hate of any form coming from your own community, from your own ideological camp, from your own social justice causes, etc.
And I agree with Abdullah, but I wonder in a sense of how do they deal with the fear that is undergirding, say, some of the pronouncements we're talking about? Because my concern is that October 7th, I think, I woke with this idea that, oh, there is real serious Jewish pain that we don't talk about. Because in this country, what do? We market black pain. We market maybe Asian alienation. But we don't talk wholeheartedly about this idea of the Jewish other as having pain. And part of what I think we're hearing from a lot of the students who are protesting is this idea that, well, clearly they don't suffer for all these stereotypical reasons, and yet as a collective, we don't talk about any other hurt in this country. And so how then do we actually find the courage that can be beyond tribalism when in fact we can't even talk about the very fear that's pushing the forms of tribalism, because we assume that, oh, if you appear strong, therefore you don't suffer. Or like with women, oh, of course women are fine. Look how they're, oh, F3, university Ivy League presidents. They're women, of course, they're fine, and yet we expect them to be super women. And we have that conversation about, well, maybe we expect Jews to be super people as well, because we have this imagination around them. But then how do we deconstruct this idea that on one hand, we have uplifted a community, while we also secretly and potentially, unfortunately, dislike that same group? Because in part, we're built on this white-black binary, and everyone's trying to get to that category of the white, whatever that means, in the very broad sense. And so my concern is that we can't deal with the tribalism because there's so much fear that's really driving what I'm hearing. Fear in terms of the Jewish pain that's neglected, fear among African Americans who are looking for a different kind of origin story, fear among the students who are like, for some reason, trying to grab onto some political ideology to gain an identity, because we're told in order to become a person at this moment, right, you have to become an ideologue. And you become an ideologue in part because we train our kids through private tutors, for students in the best schools, and you have to be the very best in this area. So whenever you debate as if you are the expert and no other voice matters. So we have created, through our middle class ideology, the very problem we claim to deny, we actually feed every week. In terms of where we live, in terms of activity. So I just feel as if I hear you, and yet part of the fear in terms of what's driving a certain kind of middle class ideology is the fear that we want our kids to be better than the next generation, the previous generation. But what's really an issue is the fear of being an outlier, right? Among so many of us. And we never address that.
Do you think that fear is coming from external or from internal, intra-tribe?
I think it's both. It's the fear of what we paint as white nationalists, and it's also the fear in terms of losing what we've built internally, whether it's these great Jewish communities or whether great black churches, right? Great black mosques. We're fear of losing that because we built it in part because we were trying to protect ourselves from something.
What texts have inspired you in your work before October 7th to get here, and also post-October 7th? What do you keep going back to in your learning? Terrence, you want to start?
Since Terrence inspired me for fear, there are three emotions who should, in our moral dashboard, you know, in your car dashboard, you see the heat, the gas. There should always be a very clear metrics of the amount of shame, guilt, and fear in your dashboard. Because these are legitimate feelings and emotions, but excessive amount of them in any society, in any individual, it always leads to moral paralysis. If you have more than minimum required fear, shame, and guilt in your system, morality and ethics suffocates. Then people say, we are weak, we are victim, or I'm afraid, therefore I have to suspend my ethics and morality. I have to. So, in response to your profound comment earlier, the very fear itself is our problem. Why have our communities are soaked and suffocated in the large amount of fear, or guilt, or shame to begin with, and therefore, in an environment where fear is overcoming individuals or collective societies, that society's ability to have a clear moral vision, clear moral horizon, let alone moral imperative and moral action, will be closely impossible. And therefore, the verse comes to my mind is from the Holy Quran. There are a few verses, I'm going to transliterate them in the sense that the fear is there to be conquered, not fear conquering you. One of the greatest impact or deception of evil forces in the world, to allow fear to envelope you, to paralyze you, so that you sort of start feeling from a point of victimhood, that you feel you have to suspend your ethics and morality in difficult situations, that you have to somehow cave in to your fears and lack of moral courage.
I've been very called by the texts throughout our tradition, the characters who are not necessarily part of the Jewish people, considered part of the Jewish people, but whose private pain we're invited to witness and to sit with. So a lot of Hagar, and thinking about her in the wilderness and watching her cry with her son and wondering what will happen to them, feeling abandoned, and also Esau. There's a beautiful midrash that when Isaac blesses Jacob, and Esau finds out that he's lost his father's blessing. He cries out, and hundreds of years later, when Mordecai cries out, when he hears that the Jewish people are to be killed in Persia, he cries out, and our rabbis connect those two cries, and they recognize in Mordecai's cry the pain of another nation, the pain of Esau coming up, this fear of non-existence. And then another text that I also felt called to is Sisera's mother, another person who's the mother of an enemy general. We don't even know her name, but after a military victory in the book of Judges, the text quickly shows her through a window crying and waiting for her son to come home, and he's died in battle. And her cry, our sages tell us, is a cry that we should hear in the sound of our shofar every year. So I've really been feeling kind of how do we hold both our story and our future and what that means, but also the pain of the people who move with us, the pain of the people who are also intimately connected to our story and what that means for today.
I think it's powerful. My grandmother was very proud because I've been returning to the Gospels. and interestingly, like Matthew, this whole idea, what you do, to the least of these, that's what you've done to me. And really trying to get a sense of what does it mean when we are protesting, we're yelling, we're trying to sort of make sense of our own political reality. Often we frame it in terms of, the enemy. And we have to sort of beat down with a person, with a group. And I go back to this idea of the Quaker sort of value of if that which is God is in everyone, how then do you respond? That's your starting point. But then this idea of how then do we have a kind of a, quote, public conversation in a pluralistic society with the belief that everyone has God in him or her or themselves. And that's the difficult part. But that's where I'm returning, in part because I am fearful, right? I'll just be very blunt. My colleagues and I are all kind of like jokingly saying, oh my God, who's going to come after us for speaking out about something? And, even my own family said, look, Terrence, you should be very careful about this whole debate because what if you say something wrong? What if you offend someone? And I've literally just been praying for the last 7 months. And I realized that I have to kind of return to the values that led me to divinity school. And while it's still very scary and frightening, I have to believe that the ancestors are living, right? And that as long as I'm being sort of truthful to my tradition, recognizing that what I believe is potentially wrong, right? I think entering the space with that notion that I'm potentially wrong, I think it's more than your intentionality, but it allows one to have the good faith, right? The bad faith is always to believe in a lie, according to Lewis Gordon, right? This idea that we believe in a lie in order then to protect ourselves. But if we enter the conversation saying, well, there's a possibility that we could be wrong, I think, again, it opens up conversation. With my feminist friends who said, well, wait a minute, Terrence, women are always asked to be vulnerable. So you're now asking Jewish people, and Israelis in particular, to be vulnerable? Do you want Palestinians to be vulnerable? Because wait a minute, all these things, you want black folks to be vulnerable, so that's where it gets kind of dicey, right? We have these great ideas of vulnerability, but what does it mean for people who can point to history? And say, no, I have, as kids would say, receipts. And I can show you what it means to be vulnerable. And that's what I think it gets really dicey, but then we have to go back to what grounds us. And I love this idea of the stories, right? The stories of the other, the stories that keep us, sustain us.
I think it's so, the landscape today is so fraught, especially around justice issues, talking about Israel-Palestine, and, any misstep seems to maybe cost you your career. And I think our role as people of faith, as theologians, is to undo that trap, that's a false binary. And I have this quote from Abraham Joshua Heschel, which I just thought was so powerful. He says, what is an idol? Any God who is mine, not yours. Any God who is concerned with me and not with you is an idol. And I think theologically, morally, that's the imperative. How do we undo the binary? How do we have to bring a grace to one another to undo that trap that we've all set up and make room for this, for shared experiences, for differing experiences.
Beautiful. So at a recent speaking event in London about 10/7, the Startup Nation writer Dan Sinor was speaking with Israeli Times journalist Haviv Retigor, and Haviv said that yes, this moment has exposed a lot of stuff that is really broken, right? But it has also perhaps given us an opportunity to fix things. So, given what you just said about fear and incredible bravery and our perhaps desire to kind of huddle back into our tribal mode, how can we take this opportunity to fix things and to step out of ourselves a little bit?
One of the most repeated prayers of Prophet Muhammad, Prophet of Islam, Allahumma min al-hammi wal-huzn. It's a profound wisdom, saying he did these prayers when he was a persecuted faith leader in Mecca, in this community. But while he was a persecuted person, he prayed that don't allow me to suffer in the hands of victimhood. Don't make me forget my own moral responsibilities, because being oppressed, being victim, being persecuted, and being innocent are not the same thing. Even the oppressed people, persecuted people, they have to have ethical moral standards. They have to aspire themselves to a level of standard. I think it's an incredible opportunity for us, as broken as we are, resist and have the moral courage and capacity not to slip into the hands of victimhood. Because if we convince ourselves into the level of victimhood, not only we will be enveloped by despair and hopelessness, but our desire, our ability to even think that even as a victim, even if I feel I have been wronged and oppressed, my community, my religion, my race have been persecuted. That is true, but I still have to strive to live a moral life and live up to ethical moral standards. Because if we cannot instill any ethical, moral, social justice struggle, this resistance against victimhood, it is very possible that the victims of yesterday could become the perpetrators of today. I hosted a Supreme Court Justice from South Africa for about a year at Duke University. And when we asked him, like, what went wrong? You tear down apartheid racism in Africa, but many South Africans are suffering more, if not worse, than before. Like, what went wrong? I will never forget his profound wisdom. In a way, he was translating Prophet Muhammad's prayer in his own experience, saying, he said, we never imagined that we could become the monsters that we are running away from. We never imagined our anger, our frustration, our desire to tear down these evil structures. We didn't prepare ourselves. What were we going to replace ourselves with? That we became the monsters that we were running away from. So, as wounded, as broken, as shaken we are, as threatened, as hated or attacked or persecuted as we are, I think that I will never be a victim, I will never be a perpetrator, and I will never be a bystander. That beautiful wisdom in the Jewish tradition should be a guiding light to us, that we should, even in those difficult moments, we should realize that we could do more harm, we could do worse, and therefore I should limit my anger and frustration and difficulty and brokenness into doing constructive work as much as possible.
You know, it's interesting. I keep going back to this idea of wanting to bring in brokenness and trauma as starting points for the conversation. And I was thinking just now of Michael Staub's book around, I think it's called Torn Asunder or something like that. But he talks about how early Jewish communities really, in some ways, veiled the Holocaust. They really wanted to talk about it publicly, in part because of not only the trauma, but the appearance of being weak. This idea that, wow, we allowed this to happen. And what's interesting is that Toni Morrison says very similar things around African enslavement, that for generations people would not talk about it because not only of fear, but it spoke to their own weakness and defensiveness. And now I wonder if we've reached a moment, say, 15, 20 years ago, the height of Clinton, where we thought, oh, we've all sort of made it, right? We have this middle class, dream come true, and we've never really talked about our trauma. We talk about Black-Jewish relations, it's all about using rights as a way to advance, about collective work around expanding voting rights and ensuring economic opportunity for everyone. And yet, these mostly men never talked about the trauma. And I think now we're seeing the implications of what one scholar calls sort of the ongoing afterlives of enslavement. I think now we're seeing the afterlives of the Holocaust, right? In terms of the pent-up anger in the U.S., and also I think the pent-up frustration of American Jews who are this kind of perennial other, right? That Eric Goldberg talks about. And so I'm wondering, is this the moment now to begin to, in some ways, bracket rights, as you mentioned earlier, Tikva, and talk about how do we start with hearing our brokenness?
I think just being in conversation over shared pain in that way, and understanding, I think for the seventh to feel the full force of Jewish history on that moment and in that day and what that felt like for so many Jewish communities. And I see the power for the teens that I work with, and they're kind of coming to that, the ability for them to articulate why that the seventh, not just that day was awful, but how they felt their family's history and how their family stories come alive that day, and to give them the space to talk about that. And I think that's one point, to kind of make sure that we're giving space to talk about that pain, but also to make sure we stay in conversation. And I took a group of teens this past summer to England for a program with the Rose Castle Foundation. It was with Muslim and Jewish and Christian teens from England and the United States. And for many of the teens, it was the first time that they'd been in serious dialogue with people of other faiths. And for some of the teens in England, it was the first time they'd met Jewish people. And they had this amazing week together where they were team building and climbing mountains and just learning, getting to know one another over text. And they had this great group chat. And after the seventh, it fell apart. They don't talk to each other anymore. And I think that, they were not able to kind of bring their pain to that conversation, that they had celebrated what their shared justice desires, their shared desire to fight climate change and to bring liberation, and to fight for liberation, but they hadn't really connected over the pain that all their communities had historically felt. And I'm seeing too that there's really an urgency, and what you said, how this conflict spills over, that there's an urgency to what's happening in Gaza and Israel, and there's also an urgency to our shared future here, and how our communities have to recognize the pain that we share, connect, and stay in dialogue.
That's a great segue to the next question. Do you want to say something?
Just very quickly though, in the spirit of Abraham Joshua Heschel has been, I think one another important reminder us is, in a broken or moment of pain, it's very difficult, it's very easy to look for who's guilty. I think in the context of civil rights movement, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said, in that context, there are few people guilty, there are few people who are racist, but all of us are responsible. How to shift, even in those difficult, broken, painful moments, from a culture of guilt, looking for African-American, Jewish-Muslim relations are experiencing one of the lowest moments. Black anti-Semitism is all-time high. Like, if we only look for who's guilty, and if you don't look why a relationship that was in incredibly solid grounds during the civil rights movement, how did it deteriorate? What exits we have missed? Who is responsible now to repair it? Let alone who's guilty for it? That should be the outlook we should be focusing on and promoting for.
Thank you. That did kind of answer my next question, but you can answer it again. So at the same speaking event that I just mentioned in London, Dan Senor said, Israel has weak institutions but a strong civil society. America has strong institutions but a weak civil society. How would you fix that for us? How would you create a stronger civil society? And by the way, knowing that it was weak before, well before 10/7, right? So I don't expect you to have a magic wand, but how would you begin to address that?
Part of what I'm doing is trying to imagine sort of the classroom in a really interesting way that I think pushes against traditional models. And by that I mean, we don't have any public spaces in which people can actually enter and experience a potentially transformative moment, right? Often when we attend these gatherings, we come bearing witness to all of what we know, right? We're very smart people, we're very engaged, and we want the world to know that we can handle right and debate. But, I want to go back to the model that I learned at a little old college called Morehouse College, historically black college in Atlanta, where the presumption was you went there in part because you knew you were missing something. And part of what's happening, I think, particularly in higher education, is that our students don't come with this sense of wonder or desire to actually create something new in their own lives. They really come from a standpoint of approval. So when you give a student an A-, it's like, oh, they're horrified. And I think this is translated out in the public sphere where we really can't debate, in part because we don't have the kind of, we don't have the muscle, we don't have the strength to endure a kind of criticism because, again, we assume the person is the enemy. It's what I'm trying to do now is imagine how do we have a space in which you come as if you're at a synagogue or a temple or a church, and you come with a critical mind in terms of to hear the speaker, but yet you have some good faith that a kernel of what the person says will be truthful, and then you hear and you engage in like a form of literature. This is like borrowing from Richard Rorty. And I'm wondering, can we create that kind of space where you come into these contexts, you're slightly critical, and you're open to what the person says. Not because you believe in all the truthfulness, but because there's something about this space that you gather and respect. And I think we have to figure out how do we build that and extend it from higher education. But I'll argue that it's happening in higher education, not necessarily the places where we want to send our children, but if we go to the Smiths colleges, we go to Brandeis, we go to the Moralesons, we go to these small, unique, go to the Haverfords, there are unique opportunities happening, but the problem is we all want the glamour, the glitz, all that glitters. And often what glitters is not, gold. So I think we have to have a kind of own cultural revolution in terms of, one, why are we sending our children to these spaces? And how do we create a culture in which people, our children, expect to have a transformative moment in a public setting? You go to any rave, the kids are like, oh, I'm really into this. They're expecting something. But they're not expecting that same thing from their professor or from the rabbi or imam.
I don't know of any trick that will solve neither the problem in Israel nor in the United States without a multi-generational visionary education system. There is no any other, in my knowledge, like putting a challenge like that. We have to really go back to our education system. You are an educator, wonderfully. All of us have involved in one form or another. I'm a naturalized American citizen. I took a written test and scored all correct. About 60% of Americans between the age of 18 to 35, if they do this test, they fail. And when Americans are asked in large numbers, what is a democracy? They often answer fair and free elections. Whereas democracy is what happens between those elections. I think there's a deterioration and of commitment to these institutions, what makes democracy democracy. We have to reinvest, not only knowledge base, knowing the basic fact, but the value and the sanctity of those institutions that runs between the elections, that brings the will of the people into practice, that bring the sort of the structures of the mechanism successfully as possible. Secondly, a lot of younger generations are disillusioned by the institutions because also we don't know how to discuss difficult chapters of our history. Those institutions didn't always work for everyone. American dream wasn't always an American dream for everyone. So in those moments, if and when our institutions fail, large segments of our society, because of their religion, because of their faith, because of their race, we don't know how to have these difficult conversations of our past and update that institution, and therefore it feels so distant and so elitist. A lot of the younger generation, they don't even buy. A, they don't understand the importance. B, they don't see themselves when they look at those institutions.
I think, too, I love this question, and to think about how faith communities are especially equipped to answer it, and how we can, what does that mean? And I got me thinking about Toni Morrison. And she has this, I think, what is the purpose of a faith community? And she wrote about a beautiful scene in Beloved, where people who had survived slavery had lived as slaves, worshiped together every week, and they walk into a clearing together. And it's children, it's parents, it's grandparents, it's multi-generational. And together they watch each other cry, and they watch each other laugh, and they watch each other dance. And they do this every week. And I think that kind of, when you're able to engage with each other in that way, in a multi-generational space where you're honoring the dignity and the gifts of every person. I think that's the unique role of a faith community, and that's what we can do. And I just want to share one story about how this could translate really into kind of a real-world application. We have at Central, we house the Coming Home program. It's a 6-month cohort for people who've come home from jail or prison, and they're paired with someone from Central, and it's called a transformational partnership. And the idea is not that they're a mentor, but that you are anchored in community. You're anchored in a community of faith. This is a person who can walk with you as you're coming home. And it's very facilitating. We work with social workers, and we talk a lot about the trauma of incarceration. And there's a lot of private moments for people who've come home where their partners are not involved. But we start every session, every week, with a meal together and a community check-in. And it is a moment where we laugh together, and we celebrate holidays, and we dance together, and we cry together. And I had someone share a story who's a member of this cohort. He was just leaving. He was on his way home. He lives in Crown Heights. And he was getting off the subway, and he saw a young Orthodox woman kind of struggling to carry her baby up the steps and the carriage and everything. And he kind of had to convince her to let him help first. And then when he did, someone came up and said, "Why would you help her out? Jews only help each other." And he said to that person, "Jews are the only people helping me right now." And I just find that that we as faith communities can create those transformational spaces when we allow the kind of joy and pain and honest and open conversation where maybe not agreement is the entry point or the barrier, but the idea that we can be open with one another and recognize the dignity in one another.
Thank you.
I might say as an extension, I wonder how many of us have asked all the kids we think are very rowdy, obnoxious, or protesting, and say, "Well, why do you think this way?" I mean, I can name dozens of kids who are like, no one's ever asked me why I think this way. And yet we are pushing back, we are condemning, and we all sides, but yet we never ask, why do you believe this? Because there's an assumption that clearly we as adults have the right answer.
One last piece of advice for us. How do we move forward? 10 words or less. I'll give you more. One last piece of advice for us as we continue to build bridges.
I just want to end by saying, I think we should walk into a conversation assuming we're going to be offended. And let's just assume that. And then get it out of the way and try to have a conversation. Let's assume we're going to be offended. And I want to say this publicly because I remember right after October 7th, I thought I was being a good little person. I reached out to someone from BJLI, the Black Jewish Leadership Initiative at Shalom. I was like, oh my God, this is terrible. Business is a moment for peace. And I'm sure Abigail probably thought, this guy is nuts. But she was so nice, and she allowed me to speak about peace. And then a few weeks later, I realized that probably wasn't the smartest thing to say at that moment. But I was being sort of the knee-jerk liberal, wanting to reach out, and yet, a few weeks later, I thought, I feel horrible for that. And yet, she allowed me to say it. It entertained me for a few days, and we eventually talked about it. And I think that's that moment where I was like, that was a dumb moment. Even regardless of the intention, it was a dumb moment. And yet, do we have the space to say, okay, we're going to have some dumb moments in this ride?
Give each other grace.
This is not entirely cooked, so don't hold it against me. But I'm writing a sermon about sacred masochism. Because things are difficult and it's going to get a lot worse. For those of us who are addicted to comfort, clarity, always seeing things clearly, knowing what to do, they will have a very hard time. For those of us who, not intentionally, lovingly, but as a necessity, welcoming pain, difficulty, complexity, those are the people who will really carry us to the promised land. Because in this kind of moment, if all of our operating frame of reference is comfort and clarity, if you don't know how to hold pain, how to, again, inevitably welcome some pain and discomfort to your life, losing some credibility in your own community, speaking truth to the power, not to the other communities, but to your own community, and holding complexity, holding these contradictory truths in your mighty heart, that's what we need. We need people who, to a certain extent, knows how to be masochistic and welcome pain and suffering into their life, and sacrifice some of their comfort, some of their whatever comfort zone that they are in for a while, for the good of the other people, for a while, they will really take us to the next level, God willing. Blessed are those who are masochistic.
Amen. I brought a poem, if that's okay. But this is something that also carried me through, a text that's been carrying through. It's called "For Nothing Is Fixed." It's by James Baldwin. He writes, "For nothing is fixed, forever and forever and forever it is not fixed. The earth is always shifting, the light is always changing. The sea does not cease to grind down rock, generations do not cease to be born. And we are responsible to them because we are the only witnesses they have. The sea rises, the light fails, lovers cling to each other, and children cling to us. The moment we cease to hold each other, the moment we break faith with one another, the sea engulfs us and the light goes out." And I think that's what good faith is, that even through the darkness, we know that we have to cling to one another.
Thank you. I think we could all listen to you go on for the next 3 days or 3 months or however long it takes us to get out of here. But I want to thank you all for your wisdom, your compassion, the dignity you give to each person that you come in contact with, and the inspiration you leave us with tonight. So thank you so much for coming and for sharing yourselves and your vulnerability with us. We're going to divide up into small group discussions now, because we want to model for ourselves what our 3 amazing panelists have modeled for us, which is a dialogue in good faith. And Sue is going to lead us through the logistics of that.